Hey, what's up, everyone? I hope you are all doing well on this Wednesday night. On tonight's episode of The Good Guy Drinks Whiskey, I am super excited to have Simon Majumdar join me on here. Simon is an acclaimed food author. He's the host of a culinary and food history podcast, Eat My Globe, and you may also recognize him as a food critic and judge on Food Network's Tournament of Champions and previous shows, Iron Chef America and Cutthroat Kitchen. So with that, let me go and invite him into this chat. So just for the listeners to understand the background, I gave Simon a whole bunch of samples. I think I sent you 12 in total, but we'll focus on the 5 that you picked out, and we'll talk about those whiskeys. We'll talk a little history, and I'll sprinkle in some other questions.
Absolutely, whatever anybody wants to ask, I'm here to serve.
Yes, absolutely. That sounds perfect. Now, before we get started and jump into these whiskeys, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and basically how you, where you started and how you kind of ended up as, a food podcaster and food critic and whatnot.
That would take the hour, I think. But, I've been doing what I do now on the Food Network for probably over a dozen years now. So being on shows like The Next Iron Chef and following all the way through Cutthroat Kitchen, Tournament of Champions, right through to now. But I've used that in the background really to talk about food history. That's my passion. So particularly, so one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you was, you look at whiskey from this incredible point of view of your taste, and you look at it from your kind of, you have an exquisite taste, I know from when I've been listening to you. And then when I look at it from why. And so when I look at whiskey, I go, well, why is whiskey? Why is this? Much as I love to taste it, but I don't have your skills. So really, that's where I come at it from this point of view. And then, so I actually did, I think I did an episode many moons ago in Eat My Globe on the history of whiskey. And I took it all the way from, first century alembic stills all the way through to kind of the current equation, as it were. And so I just find it really fascinating why we have this, how we can have 5 here, the 12 that you sent me all together, and they're so different. And they're so different. Plus as well, I know that we added in one in a separate glass so we could try something totally different. And I'm fascinated by how that happened, by the people that got involved to make that happen. If you mention Henry VIII or all these people who get mentioned as part of it. And so for me, having this kind of conversation where you could help me to understand the nuances and the elegance of the flavors, and I could go, but by the way, did you know? And share some of that. I think we'll have your fans, of which I know you have many, understanding whiskey in a way that'll give them more consciousness of what it is other than just a nice drop, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that absolutely makes sense. And for me, there's no other drink out there that the history and the place that goes into the spirit. I mean, whiskey itself is kind of a time capsule. You have a 20-year-old single malt whiskey, and you just think about the time that's passed through it, and the where it was matured and the environment it kind of absorbs. And then you look at, like you said, the history of the distillery and how whiskey became what it is today. So I mean, that's all that stuff goes to the romance and the beauty of whiskey.
Because what you're looking at as well is, I'm sure we'll talk about this, why certain things happen to make whiskey taste. So why you have sherry barrels, why you have bourbon barrels, the kind of symbiotic relationship between, the bourbon and whiskey, and bourbon and sherry, and whiskey and sherry. And for me, those things are really, really important because they kind of explain to me why it's so important. And to me, I'm nosing more than anything else today, but what you find out is that everything you have has a reason. It has a reason why it happened, and I just find it so fascinating that, and this is true with cognac. This is true with, I've just written about rum. This is true with gin. This is true with tea. This is true with, and what I think is, what I'm determined to do is that I think we eat a lot, and we think about eat and drink a lot, and we think about it in the sense of almost gluttony. Oh, here's a big plate of this, or I'm drinking a whole bottle of bourbon, or whatever it is. But what we don't do is sit back and have some elegance about it and just go, actually, let's think about why. Why, to me, is the biggest question.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, there's no better drink to be contemplative and kind of philosophical about than whiskey. And actually, part of the reason I initially got into whiskey years ago was for that very reason, not over consuming it, but just to have a little bit of a few different styles, and then you can kind of really compare, contrast them, and you can get a much bigger picture and an interesting look at whiskey. And then you do get curious about the history that went into it and everything that's kind of
and I
goes
think
behind the whiskey.
With coming from the Scottish area, the variety is endless. You know, particularly now when you know, we go back even only 20, 30 years ago, where it was, you know, fairly much what I call workaday expressions, the 12, the 18, the blah, 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 all of which may have had varieties within them. But then once you started getting, you know, the kind of bad boys of Brookladdick, or all of these, none of which, not all of which I agree with. I'm not a great fan of finishing whiskies. But once you started getting some of the bad boys coming in and going, well, let's put this in a Nick barrel, let's do this. The opportunities for what happens with whiskey now are endless, and so for me, you know, if you're going to look for a hobby and you want to have it in a kind of an alcoholic area, then this is one of the places to be.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's part of the reason why I love Scotch whiskey, is because of the flexibility and freedom you have in the cask maturations, and even the distillation type, the fermentation time, the yeasts you use, everything. There's so many little dials they can you know, turn to change a whiskey into something completely unique and interesting, that it's just really incredible. I mean, you can see all the whiskey I have behind me, and it's all just it's just based on curiosity. I'm just curious to see, and whiskey is always better shared, so that's why I'm glad I was able to share some with you, and just to kind of get your take on it. And it is really just a wonderful hobby, and it does encourage you to explore other spirits, like the cognac I sent you. I got that purely based on my love for whiskey, and that intrigued me on rum, that intrigued me on cognac, and the various other spirits out there.
Well, again, the story, and we'll touch on that when we come to it, the story of brandy, the story of cognac, the story is a completely different one. Obviously, A, from where it comes, which is obviously very different. But B, for why it was produced, and the fact that it's, you know, you know, if I'm allowed, and you may just want to stop now, kind of brandy is probably in my kind of number one spirit. I think it's a spirit that does, and we'll get to that. I'm talking ahead of myself.
Yeah, so is brandy your spirit of choice? Like, if you had to eliminate everything else, what would you,
well, I would never put myself in the situation of eliminating everything else, so I want to make that absolutely clear. Because, again, why? But yes, to me, brandy is, I think, right now, and this sounds crazy because it was obviously the number one spirit in the world 100 and something years ago, but to me it's underrated. I think because people don't know, they just go, it's another brown liquor, and you go, let me tell you the story of the Dutch, let me tell you the story of, you know, let me tell you the story of Winston Churchill drinking Ararat brandy every morning in his bunker. Let me tell you the story of, you know, Pomace. Let me tell you the story of, you know, all of these different brandies. So I know we'll talk about that, but for me, it has just as much variety, and it has. There's an element of me that I kind of wish that I was a kind of a Victorian academic, and when I'm sitting there with my large lead crystal balloon of something special from Armagnac or from wherever, that at least allows me to pretend that. I'm not smart enough for that ever to be the case. But I do think if I was sitting there and I could imagine drinking it, there is a kind of Proustian element for me of drinking brandy that I and I adore Scotch. Don't get me wrong, but I don't get from Scotch.
Yeah, yeah, no, without a doubt. And actually, I was listening to your Eat My Globes episode of Brandy just earlier today, and after listening to it, I was actually on some of my whiskey shops looking up some brandies that they had on offer. I was like, maybe I should be expanding my brandy and cognac collection, because this is the only one I have, is the one I sent you. So my experience with brandies are very, very limited, but you know, when I was seeking this one out, I was looking for things I would look for in a whiskey. You know, something that was higher proof. So this one's at over 50% ABV, which I love. Something that's got some age to it, and then something that is reasonably good value. Like this 46-year-old cognac. If this was a 46-year-old Scotch whiskey, it would have been 10 times the price of what I paid for the cognac. So
the value is just pretty incredible for some of the ages.
Yeah, and I will say this is a really good one. I mean, the aroma is beautiful. You are actually getting a little bit of that kind of treacly note coming up. I guess we've started with cognac.
I guess so. No, this is a good place to start, because I know you mentioned that you wanted to discuss a little bit about the history of brandy and how Scotch or whiskey kind of overtook it in the 1870s. So I think this would be a kind of a good
segue into that
first
conversation.
Of all, you kind of have to talk about and I'm just enjoying. I'm just having fun with this. This is the first thing is you have to realize that brandy comes from a totally different place. So it's, you know, you're talking about fruit, you're talking about wine. Particularly here, we're talking about cognac. In many ways, it has more terroir. If one can talk about terroir with distilled spirits, but I think you can with this, because it can only be produced at certain times of the year. So this is produced from a white wine, but it can only be produced from October to March when they don't put sulfites in the wine. So again, it's very well. But the reason it was produced has got nothing to do with. So what we have wasn't the reason why it was produced to drink this way. It was the Dutch basically distilling white wines from France, from that region, so they could ship them in a more kind of what's the word I'm looking for, economic manner. So they would distill them down, and the notion was that once they distill them down, they're distilled in kind of copper stills, usually twice. The first time you're going to get almost like an eau de vie, which is what you might get in, say, Bordeaux with wine, you know, skins. And then the idea was that they were supposed to rehydrate them, and then the Dutch could drink them and ship them around the world. But then someone went, bloody hell, this is good, and so they created this brandy. I mean, and we're not talking about, you know, I mean, you go back quite a long time with it, but this is down to, what I love about this is this drink is down to Dutch entrepreneurialism. And the Dutch were the great, the first, one of the first, the Portuguese probably the first, the great producers of, you know, trade around the world. To me, once you smell this, it has, I think this to me smells of history. It smells of a library. It smells of an ancient library in France. It smells of all that history. It has this richness to it. It has, we talk about terroir with a lot of things, but to me, brandy, and if you're a Scotch fan or a whiskey fan in general, whiskey from around the world, and I'm a big fan of whiskeys from all over the globe, this, to me,
absolutely,
cognac is a perfect place to kind of tap in, to try another one of the brown spirits that comes from a totally different place. The other part about it is that I think is really interesting is that it's cultural identity. So the number one, I think, cognac in the United States is Hennessy. I believe it might be. I think it's Hennessy. Yeah. But 80% of the population of it who drink it are African American. So it has this huge relationship. So that's why you'll see Hennessy being mentioned in rap songs, and part of it was during the Second World War, the people in France were very tolerant of, you know, African American troops, and so they wanted them coming into the bars. I read something today that in a bar in one place, one of the American military police were trying to ban African American troops going into these bars in these French villages, and they said they wanted a race, kind of a race. What's the word I'm looking for? Delineation. So the French town just put a sign on all the bars saying "Black troops only," which I just think is the most fantastic story. So. So
Absolutely.
What I love is that we have this cultural identity with a drink from France that now we even see in the United States. And they were very, very smart. So in the very early part of after the war, many, many, many of the top executives of Hennessy in America were African American. Mm-hmm. They go, we love this community. They're part of our community. We want them to be. And so you're drinking something that not only is delicious, of course, and this with cheese, this with a hard crumbly cheese, like a cheddar. Oh my gosh! This with just some fruit, some grapes, just some charcuterie, is amazing. But what you're also doing is you're drinking cultural history.
Absolutely, yeah, no, without a doubt, and just knowing that, like learning that history behind this cognac. And brandy in general, it just adds to the experience and the significance. You know, this is a part of history. And then the one that we're drinking itself, it's from the 70s to begin with, so it's got its own history in just that. So it does enhance the whole experience. And I will 100% agree with you that this, especially once you get some of those higher strength cognacs and brandies, for a whiskey drinker looking to kind of expand outside
of whiskey,
I think
this would be a perfect thing to pick up.
And this is not meant to sound kind of condescending. This to me is a great entry point for a really good cognac. And then if you like these, that's when you can begin to move on and go, well, I'm a huge fan of Armagnacs. Well, Armagnacs are very different. Those are lembic stills. They're a little tough. They're a little more, rye, W-R-Y, in terms of their attitude. But they work beautifully. But this to me, is a great one. So I was so pleased when you had it. I think it's a terrific maker. And I think if anyone wants to go and have fun, go and see some of the stores now. And what you're finding right now from a purchase point of view is that everyone, a lot of the stores now, whether it's a big Bevmo or they're doing great prices on brandy because they want them to have it. And then once you get involved, you know what it's like. Once you get obsessed with it, you start going, well, by the way, Armenian brandy, Ararat, the one that Churchill drank, that Stalin sent him 400 bottles a year, sent him. You start having those, and then you start going, well, Greek brandies, or then some of my particular favorites, Spanish brandies that are made out of the skins from sherry making. The Palomino grape. Again, it has this whole kind of symbiotic relationship with things that will then come back into whiskey. So for me, this is a great place to start. So thank you for indulging me with that one.
No, absolutely, and I do have one bottle of Armagnac on my shelf too, which I haven't opened yet. I've been meaning to as even though that's very different from a brandy or cognac. I would just be curious to
taste those differences between the two.
Like all of this, it's all about fun. And there are some whiskies.
Yeah, absolutely.
We'll talk about some, I'm sure, as we go through. And I mentioned Brooklandic earlier. There are some whiskies I go, don't get it. You're allowed to go, I don't like that. And I think that's one of the things in whiskey that you do, and I know when you talk about it, you go, it doesn't blow me away. And you're allowed to do that even if people who I admire more than Dave Broom or any of those people go, I love this, and I go, okay, that's fine, but I don't. And so I think what we find here with the whiskies you've sent me and the ones that the other ones you sent, you're allowed to have an opinion. You're not just being talked to by, and if you talk to the great cocktail historians like Dave Wondrich or all of these folks, they're the ones who go, it's an opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. It's completely subjective, and your palate is different from mine. And there's some whiskeys that can connect with a lot of people, but then there's some that I may prefer that you may not. Like, for example, you said you're not a big fan of finished whiskeys. And for me, there are some finished whiskeys that I absolutely love. I think it just really adds an extra dimension to it and a different characteristic. So, but it does inspire conversation and discussion, and it's, it's all
a very
as long as it's
community.
friendly,
It's
I
okay
think that's the key.
not
I mean,
agree.
to me, I always say that finished whiskeys are like painting racing stripes on a Toyota Corolla. It's just like, I don't get it.
Yeah.
Either just make a
Yeah.
good whiskey. If you have to finish your whiskey, there's probably something wrong with your whiskey. It's almost going into the food point of view. Once you have to start slopping barbecue sauce on your barbecue, there's something wrong with your meat.
Yeah, no, and that makes a lot of sense. If it's good before you need to finish it, why would you necessarily finish it? No, that makes a lot of sense for sure. And one of the ones I sent you was one of my all-time favorite Scotch whiskeys. It was the Delewin 23-year-old. It's not in tonight's lineup, but when you get a chance to try that one is like your bare bones Scotch whiskey. It's just aged for 23 years in hogshead, no finishes, no special casks, but the experience it delivers is just exceptional. The strong tropical fruits and the creaminess. I mean, that one is really a lights out Scotch whiskey. So I'm excited to hear your thoughts on that when
you get around to it.
Excellent.
Yes, and so the one we started off with, the Cognac, that'll obviously have the strongest nose of our whole lineup tonight. I mean, I guess peat moss can have a bit of a strong smell too. But, from this one, moving on to, let's say, like the Loch Lomond 18-year-old, which is the first time I'm actually trying this one. I haven't actually tried this one yet. You picked a closed bottle for me here. And I guess part of the question is, and the nose might be a little subdued compared to the Cognac that we just had. So you might have to search a little bit more.
But you definitely get some of those classic
To me, just that
characteristics.
little drop,
I
that
get some,
tiny drop of water,
Go ahead.
that little, as we used to say in England, a little threat, Scotch and a threat, that little threat of water.
Yeah.
Yep, I've got my little dropper right here for that exact reason.
And this is, and I used that word earlier, and it sounds like workaday. This is to me what Scotch kind of used to be, and by that,
Oh yeah.
we've gone off in lots of different directions, and we've had lots of clever things happening. But sometimes you go, actually, it's kind of nice. It's like going to watch. It's like going to watch.
Oh yeah.
This reminds me of watching Lucille Ball on a Sunday, if that makes sense. It goes, I know exactly what it is. I've seen it a million times before.
Yeah.
Smelt it a million times before. I really enjoy it. It is never going to change my life, but I'm really enjoying it. And I think if that's how it makes sense to me.
Yeah, and I agree. It kind of has a bit of a musky smell to it. It's a little dirty, and it's like an old school Scotch whiskey, sort of like a Ben Nevis, where this is Scotch seemingly as it used to be, and which is kind of curious because Loch Lomond Distillery itself is a relatively young distillery, all things considered. It was founded in 1965, so it's not necessarily that old, but it's one of the more innovative distilleries. I think they've got 4 styles of stills. They've got a straight neck pot still, a standard swan neck pot still, a coffee continuous column still, and then the traditional column still. So they can make a whole plethora of styles of whiskey, slightly peated, not peated. So
They're doing a lot of cool things at Loch Lomond.
You would never. This is never a whiskey you'd ever complain about as smelling. I mean, obviously, I think about as well, when I think about a lot of whiskies, I think about going back to, how relatively new kind of single malts are by comparison. And if you go back to the times of the Victorian times and, the blends that people used to make, Johnny Walker making his blend, or all of these people, so it's I think they're always going to be a little bit new, but to me, like you're never going to be unhappy having this.
No, definitely not. For beginner whiskey drinkers, this may be seem a little harsh in terms of the flavor profile because of its old school dirty nature. But once you kind of get into it a little bit, this is just a nice whiskey. I mean, this is the first time I've had it, and it just sips so well and so pleasantly.
What are the barrels?
Really enjoying. And then
barrels?
So I tried to look it up you know, I was doing some research on this, and the only thing they say is it's aged in oak barrels, which is no information at all. But if I had to guess, I would say it's a combination between ex-bourbon and ex-sherry casks.
What's really interesting, because I wondered about the sherry, and obviously we're in this, you know, sherry was that historically what majority of barrels were for Scotch anyway.
Yeah.
And obviously that changed as, you know, there's a lot less sherry being produced now, and in fact, sherry's being produced just to put into barrels so they can have sherry barrels. And one of the things I find really fascinating is, again, we talk about that relationship, is that a lot of them, you get sherry producers now in Spain. We had a house in Spain. Spain is like my second home. But they will supply sherry barrels, and then what will happen is that sherry will vinegar, and then that gets sent back to Spain, where it gets sold as sherry vinegar. So again, there's that. So by having the sherry barrels coming back into fashion, Scotch is now allowing sherry vinegar to be recreated in Spain again at a level. So again, I love that relationship that those distillers can have.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's like a symbiotic relationship where they help each other out in terms of creating their product, but also reusing it. So it is very cool how that happens. And basically people were looking for a supplement for their brandy, and in comes Scotch whiskey, but at first was a little abrasive, but those sherry casks, that's what got it, kind of settled it down.
Well, it allowed it to
enjoy
be
it more.
Smart enough, clear enough that it was seen as something that, you know, kind of the kind of more fine people would drink. You know, they wouldn't be drinking gin, obviously, because that was like the crack cocaine of its day. Brandy they couldn't get, obviously, because of the wars, and it was all being blocked. And so this relationship with Britain is at the heart of most of it. But the relationship of Britain with sherry and with port, creating these drinks that were basically wines that were fortified with local brandies to fortify them, so they could ship to England. And that's why sherry, port, Madeira, all of these fortified drinks became so popular. And we've lost touch with them, but I am a huge fan of sherry. And so kind of labyrinthine kind of stories we have, and if people get chance to listen to Eat My Globe on those, I do a really interesting interview with Dave Brown, who talks about the history of sherry, and you know, all of the things. And port is a perfect example as well. That's why if you go to Porto, the majority, not all, but the majority of the port producers all have British names, because they were all created to ship
that's very
port up to. And I will always have port in the house here. I love drinking port. But to me, again, this was a great selection. So thank you for.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you know, and speaking of port and some of those cask finishes, I always encourage people to explore the origin spirit that some of these whiskeys are aged in. So if you have a port matured or a whiskey matured in port pipes or port casks, try out the port, because then when you actually drink the whiskey, you can really understand those flavor profiles and why it's in part and integrated with that whiskey. So all that stuff is you know, it's very fascinating how everything kind of mixes together and
you know, ends up
that osmotic kind of process of, you know, what, you know, the as they always say, the barrel giveth and the barrel taketh away. And with something like port or sherry, even bourbon, even with this, you know, the fact that it's only being used one time in bourbon, it still works. And then even with the toasting, and then with all of those developments that you have, they all change what you have as a finished product. And like I said, you can have arguments about whether you agree with this or disagree with it, but it's fascinating stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a style for all types of palates and personalities, and that's the beauty of whiskey and all these spirits and drinks that we're talking about. It's just fascinating. You don't necessarily drink it for the effects of the alcohol; you drink it for the experience and kind of the journey it takes you on, which is the beautiful thing about it. That's, you know, it's hard not to love this stuff. So let's look at our next whiskey here. The next one I'm going to go with is the Compass Box Magic Cask. So this one is also the first time I'll be trying it for tonight. I just opened the bottle to give you a sample, and this is 92%, 22-year-old Imperial whiskey, which was aged in first fill bourbon barrels. And Imperial Distillery, of course, is a no longer existed. It doesn't exist anymore. It's been demolished in 2013. And then it's, interestingly enough, there's 8% very young, 4-year-old, what I think is Craigellachie, from first fill Oloroso sherry butts, which is a very interesting combination because in one hand you have this unique aged distillate that doesn't exist anymore, and you're kind of throwing at this very young sherried whiskey, and how does that kind of play with each other?
So for me, I should offer a kind of a disclosure here with Compass Box, because many years ago now, we're talking 2006, so yeah, a long time ago, I got to know, and I've lost touch with him a lot now, but John Glaser, of course. John Glaser, to me, is one of the kind of true entrepreneurs of whiskey making. He's just true. I still remember going to visit him in his office with his bottle of spirit caramel with a cross through it on his desk, that he hates his spirit caramel. And so I got to know him. This was when he was really first launching. I remember sitting in a very, very good cocktail bar in London, which is now, it's part of a steak house range called Hawksmoor now, but they had one restaurant there, and I was with the bartender, Nick Strangeway, one of the great bartenders in the world. And he introduced me to John. I still remember this one Tuesday night. We sat there till probably 2 o'clock in the morning, and John was just sharing the very early expressions of Compass Box. And this was after he'd left Diageo. And I think, and I may have got the story wrong, but he'd gone to Diageo going, I really want to make these just unique whiskies. I want to go. And they said, this isn't us, but we want you to do this because you're John Glaser. We want you to do it. So that's how I got to know Compass Box. And I think the very first one I tasted is still the one that is my kind of number one here, was the Peat Monster, which to me is, it's still, I have an enormous bottle of it here, and it's still just something that I adore drinking, and my wife hates the smell of, but I love. And then what happened was, when I was writing my very first book, Eat My Globe, I went to 31 countries in a year. I ended up going all around the world to write about food. And one of the things I really wanted to do was to go and make whiskey. And so I emailed John and I said, do you know anybody? Well, of course you do. You're John Glaser, but do you know anyone? And so he wrote back, and being an incredibly generous man, said, well, why don't you come with me, you and Nick, to Islay? And there's this new distillery that hasn't even released anything yet, which we're going to talk about in a moment, Kilchoman. And he said, we'll go and make whiskey for a week. So I ended up going up with John and Nick to Islay on a very bumpy flight from Glasgow, I still remember. We ended up spending a week going to every one of the Diageo affiliated distilleries. While we were there, I ended up eating oysters and getting very sick, and ended up on a drip in the one-room hospital in Islay. Which was not good, but a great story for a book. And it really changed how I thought about whiskey, because not only did it change, my appreciation of the amount of work that went into it, which quite frankly I didn't have. But I understood, I ended up floor malting. I ended up doing all of the things that people used to do, because Kilchoman had a whole range that was floor malted at this point. I don't know whether we'll talk about them in a moment, but it made me appreciate just what a bloody hard business this is. And so I think
absolutely.
John Glaser and B, Compass Box will always have a very special place in my heart. So I'm not necessarily the best person to judge them, because I think I look at them through very kind of rose-tinted spectacles. So I'd love to know what you think about this. I mean, I smell it. I'm really enjoying it. I don't quite understand a lot of that mixture between the kind of old and new. Seems to me just because we can. But maybe I'm just being kind of a little, I don't have any kind of nuance.
Well, no, I think without a doubt, some of that young sherried whiskey does come through in this, but and you know, it usually takes me a few drams to really understand whiskey, but right on the nose, I do get most of those old ex-bourbon notes that you'd get, some of those tropical fruits. I get some pineapples, so maybe, so, you know, like some vanillas and cream. It's a very nice. It's got a very, very nice nose. But underlying that, I do get a little bit of those. You know,
with sherry cask, you tend to get some more
little
dark fruits, raisins,
maybe a little dark chocolate. And my first sip of this, which I just had right now, was very interesting. It was almost like I had two different whiskeys poured in my mouth at once. I could taste the aged 22-year-old ex-bourbon cask, but I could also taste that youth, that like brightness of the young sherried whiskey. So my first impressions are very positive, but I'm a little biased towards Compass Box, as you are, because almost everything I've had of theirs is absolutely exceptional. And I think one of John Glaser's missions was to help people understand that blended malts and just blended whiskeys in general can really be some of the best whiskeys you've ever had. And a lot of the stuff I've had from them is phenomenal, and this one included. So I do like it. And just, you know, as you mentioned, the history is always interesting, and just knowing that you're drinking whiskey from a distillery that has been demolished, this stuff will never exist again, adds to some of the intrigue
and
the
experience that we have. They didn't do that many releases, if I'm right, did they? I think they only did one or two.
Yeah, so Imperial Distillery has a 100-year history, but for about 60% of those 100 years, it was closed. They never got the timing right. And I think it was originally opened in 1897 right around the time of Queen Victoria's Jubilee celebration. And they named it after the royal house, obviously Imperial, but they never gained much mainstream success. You know, when they moved to single malts, they were behind the curve, so they never really got to the market. And then they started up again in the early 90s, and 1998, that was the end of their production. So this is probably some of the, you know, late 90s the whiskey that we're drinking right now. But it's just adds to the kind of intrigue knowing that you're drinking
I think
whiskey
I mean, the reality is, I'm not sure John is capable of making a whiskey that's boring. I mean, they just whether people like it all the time is obviously a different matter. But I mean, I think this is. I'm looking forward when I'm, you know, going to sit down and sample all of these of enjoying them a great deal.
Yeah, absolutely. Just on the palate, I get some like peanuts. Some of those tropical fruits we discussed, some of those raisins. I mean, it really is a well-integrated whiskey. So I am enjoying it. I'll have a more of a well thought out opinion once I get to try it some more. And I sent you another Compass Box, I believe, the Compass Box No Name Number 1, not part of tonight's lineup. I don't know if you had a chance to try that one, but it's in the kind of similar to your peat monster. It's a peated one, heavily backed by Ardbeg, and that one is just unbelievably delicious because the Ardbeg paired with that creamy, waxy Clenleash is just such a wonderful combination. That's one you can just sit there and think about and sip on.
When I think of Ardbeg, I think again when we were on that trip that the distiller there, whose name escapes me right now, it's probably retired now, but had opened like this 21-year-old kind of his barrel and had literally opened it for us while we were there, and we were drinking this sitting in the barrel in the rooms with all the barrels and just sipping it. And what it makes me realize is that for me as well, whiskey is about context as well. It's like being in, we can sit and we can drink it here, And of course, we're going to have exceptional whiskies made by exceptional people. But when you are in situ, and for anyone who hasn't had the chance to go to any whiskey distillery, whether it's in the United States or, I've been lucky enough, whether it's in Asia or wherever it is, to go in Japan or wherever to go and try them, there is something special about when you're in those positions. And I think it physically does alter what you're drinking. So I'm really intrigued with this. I'm excited with all of these.
No, and I 100% agree with that. Context is essential when you're drinking. Most of my whiskey drinking, I'll do a tasting by myself. It's always fun and enjoyable. Anytime I'm with one of my whiskey friends who are enthusiasts like I am, the experience is always elevated because just having that camaraderie and that discussion, and then you compound that if you're in like a dunnage warehouse drinking straight from the cask. I mean, the experience is second to none in terms of drinking whiskey. And actually later this summer, some friends and my dad and my uncle and I were going out to Springbank Distillery and doing the whole Springbank tour, which is my favorite distillery. So I'm very much looking forward to that experience. Yes. Do you have a favorite distillery? Do you have like one that, I mean, I know you spent a week at Kilchoman, but is that your favorite, or do you actually have a different
whiskey? In terms of the
whiskey?
most beautiful distillery, or the one that just made me kind of go, wow, we're actually going to come with, that's one of the selection that we have coming up. And particularly it's beautifully designed, and as you look through the windows from the still room, I think you look across from there to Jura, if I'm correct. So it's Kalila.
All right. Yeah.
And when you look across from and Kalila, to me, well, I guess I don't want to get out of order, but I'm guessing.
No, Kalila in terms of a tasting lineup, I would probably do Kalila before Kilchoman, because Kilchoman, being a younger Scotch whiskey, that peat's gonna be a little bit richer. So the Kilchoman, or the Kalila, is probably the better one to taste in this lineup first before you get to that younger, brighter.
And to me, what the smell of this Kalila, the hogshead, just actually reminds me of being in that. The moment you walk in, it is if you go online, you'll see it. It's the most gorgeous still room. And then they have an enormous, almost full thing of window. And if I'm right, and I may have got my geography wrong, but I don't think I have. You look across, and the next thing you see is Jura.
Yeah, no, that is incredible. And just think about that. Like, you just nose it, and it immediately transports you to the location. I mean, that's part of the beauty of whiskey.
I mean, it really can have that effect on you.
And the thing that I think about Kalila is we think about it now as being a very, Kalila's got such an amazing reputation, and of course it should have. But only certainly well within my lifetime, this was something for a blend. And now when you think about it now, of course, yes, it's still being used in that situation, but you go, really? I'm smelling this now, and I'm going, there was a point, and actually I'm going to make a defense in terms of blends, because I'm a great fan of blends. And, particularly if I come to cocktail making and I'm having a Rob Roy, I want a Dewars, I'm Rob Roy, after a martini, a Rob Roy is my number one drink. And I want Dewars. So when people try to get too clever, I'm like, you're missing the point of what that drink is. So I'm a great fan of, sometimes sit down and give me a Johnny Walker and I go, thank you very much, And one of my kind of joys is if you've ever had a British digestive biscuit, it's a digestive biscuit is like the original version of a graham cracker. So Victorian times, hence the name digestive. You ate it, but have go and try this. Have a glass of Johnny Walker, tiny bit of water, and a digestive biscuit, and it is just like a very special thing. But so I'm making my defense of blends, because I think what happens sometimes in the United States, particularly, we begin to fetishize single malts because you can make. That's where the money is. And sometimes we forget that people are making really good bloody blends, and still do make really good bloody blends. And sometimes I think we're missing out. like I have people who say to me, well, I only drink single malts. And I go, why? Why would you miss out on something? Because at incredible value, and we've talked about value, which we'll talk about in a moment, I know, with Kilchoman. At incredible value, you're getting really well-made whiskies by really talented people that you can buy at $40 a bottle. So part of what I like to do is to go to people, if the worst thing that happens is you spend $40 on a bottle of whiskey that you can share with friends and you go, well, that was fine, but I don't necessarily need to do it again. I think you should definitely give it a try. But the reason I do say this with this Caol Ila is that when I'm smelling this, and this was the one of all of them so far before we started, this is the one I just literally had up to my nose the entire time, because it's kind of poetic. It's kind of got it's gentle, but it's kind of, I like to think of poets and places that go with whiskies, and this kind of just reads to me. It's not Robert Burns. It's not shouty. It's gentle, and at some point, someone would have thought that this needed to be hidden away somewhere, and I don't get it, because this is magnificent.
Oh yeah, no, this is, just nosing it now. I get that gentle peat. Obviously, the longer a peated whiskey is in a barrel, the peat kind of takes a second, backstage to the overall whiskey. But this one just has such a pleasant, gently peated nose. You can get some coastal characteristics in it, and then on the palate, it's just so well integrated. It's nice and soft. It's a 46% ABV, so it's not so soft it tastes watery, but it's not a cask strength. So on the palate, it's just
soft
and you will,
velvety.
You will know a lot more than I will about this, but that hogshead, is that the thing that's helping that softness?
I think it's the age, the 15 years is kind of making it soft, and then the I think this is kind of like the classic Caol Ila spirit. This is their default distillate. Caol Ila is kind of a very, it's even though it's more well known now than it was, say, 20 years ago, it's still a little bit of an under the radar Islay Scotch whiskey, even though it's the biggest distillery on Islay. They produce the most whiskey, but usually when you get an independent bottling of an Islay whiskey, more often than not, it's a Caol Ila, and it always delivers. It always delivers like it's nothing, outrageous. It's just your classic Islay whiskey. When you think of classic Islay whiskey, I think of maybe like a Lagavulin 12-year-old, another sample I sent you, or a nice Caol Ila like this. It's just such a soft, very, very nice whiskey. I'm very impressed with this one. And again, this is my first time trying it. You picked 4 new openings for me, so I'm glad that you're
encouraging me to open up some more of my bottles.
And I may be wrong, because I think most of the Caol Ila, the peating is done on the mainland, isn't it? I think that is right. But whereas if you go to people are going to correct me because I'm sure I'm wrong in some, but like if you go to Butter Harbin or something, that's peated there. It's pretty intense. Whereas if you go to this, I think the kind of standard peat maltings you're going to get on the mainland just mean that it's a lot more subtle.
Yeah.
But I want to put this in a kind of nose bag and tie it around my nose and fall asleep with it and wake up with it. And
it really is a beautiful nose, without a doubt, and a very nice whiskey. Weems, the independent bottler where this whiskey comes from, is another. It's one of those great valued whiskeys. You can usually get pretty well aged stock from them, and their whiskey tends to be pretty good. So Caol Ila, definitely a whiskey that people should check out more and kind of encourage people to try. And they release an official bottling of an unpeated Caol Ila.
I've never tried. Wow, I've not tried.
Unbelievably delicious.
It is shockingly good how good their unpeated whiskey is. I feel like you almost get some subtle peatiness to it, maybe because it's in your mind, or they're using the same equipment to create the whiskey. But it's a very, very well-made
this was
whiskey.
fun. This was, it's all fun, but this is just one of those. This is what we were talking about. Like I said, I come at this, I like to think I have some expertise in its histories and how it gets there. But I know there are a gazillion people on earth who've got better, taste experiences than me. Some of the super tasters that I meet, and you've obviously got, experience doing this.
Yeah.
So I don't come at it from that point of view, other than, I don't know art. I know what I like, but this, to me, I think you'd have to be very strange not to like this.
Yeah, without a doubt. And I think when it comes to tasting and nosing a whiskey in general, there really is no right or wrong answer. I mean, what you smell is what you smell, what you taste is what you taste. So, it doesn't have to be a science, or the experts who taste one thing doesn't necessarily mean you're going to taste those same things. Sometimes I read what you should be tasting on the side of a box, and I'm like, oh, this looks more like marketing fluff than anything. Like, I'm gonna taste what I taste. So, I'm always a little bit hesitant to kind of dive right into like tasting notes or nosing notes, because more often than not, they're just what I smell or taste, and you might have a different experience.
Excellent. And this has been, I have to say, this is so much fun.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, I'm having a lot of fun just talking about it, and you're being modest when you say you don't know if you're bringing some history into it. Your knowledge and your history about whiskey and spirits in general is extraordinarily helpful, and it just makes the whole experience enhanced that much better. Because if anything, when you're drinking whiskey, understanding the history and what the building blocks were to what it is
today is
well, I think if people, if people have the opportunity and the inclination to go and listen to the Eat My Globe episode on it, we talk about, the fact that Queen Victoria, she loved her whiskey, and she would go to, the royal, she would go to the local places where they were making them, where obviously there was no licenses, and in the end, I can't remember who it is now. My mind has gone on which distillery it was, but it's with almost walking distance. It was a short carriage journey, and she would turn up all the time to go and get some whiskey. And in the end, they basically said to her, well, we better give it a license because the Queen keeps turning up. And that was the first of these distilleries. And again, once you start having the Queen Victoria going, well, I'm going to drink this. Then that made it kind of much more credible, and then because everyone copied the Queen. The other thing that I love talking about, and just to throw in the history of it, is the kind of religious aspect. So obviously you go back to the 1st century, and the alembic stills and the original distilling was all done for Christian alchemy. So and then you come through kind of the Middle Ages, where it became a medicine, eau de vie. And whiskey obviously comes from that Latin of eau de vie. But what I find really fun with this as well is that it wasn't long before like the kings started going, well, I just like drinking this while I'm playing cards. And so that whole medicinal thing kind of got dropped relatively soon. And then, of course, the fact is that once Henry VIII decided he was going to leave the Catholic Church and set up the Church of England, the first thing he did, of course, was close down all the monasteries and destroy them. So all of the medicinal spirit makers in those places had to leave. They went from being monks in these monasteries to being homeless. What happened then was the people who were in the great stately homes were like, well, come stay with us. And they became the medicinal makers. And that was the beginning of what we now have in terms of our whiskey makers, our distillers, those first distillers. And so, Henry VIII basically just wanting to get a new wife is like vital to why we have amazing whiskey. And it's stories, when I go Eat My Globe, I always talk about things you didn't know about food. That's how I describe it. And I love that fact. That we want to, the reason we have all of this is because, quite frankly, Henry VIII wanted to get laid.
Yeah, which is absolutely amazing to think about. Everything that we're talking about tonight can be stemmed from that one pinpoint in history, and how it diverged into everything that came after.
Everything that we have
absolutely remarkable.
And every spirit has a story that will be close to that. But I don't think there's anyone quite as, and obviously there's lots of labyrinthine kind of ways as you go through this, but I think it's just such fun to do. So if people get a chance to go and listen, I just think it's really fun. And similarly, I just did, like I said, the history of rum. And rum is another one of those drinks that once you get into it, you realize that at one point, I think it's the mid 1800s, the United States, New England, was making more rum than anywhere else in the world. And even before that, the 1700s. And in fact, they argue that the American War of Independence was more about rum than tea or anything else. It's because they started kind of charge them tax on thetheir rum, and the Americans were like, we're not paying. Americans don't like to pay tax at the best of times. They certainly weren't going to pay it on their rum. So I love these stories about something that we can sometimes, not that you do, because it's something that you're obsessed with in the nicest sense of the word, but we take these things for granted. We take whiskey, we take it like as something that's just ubiquitous. And you go, actually, it's the stories of how we got there are fascinating and often very dark.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, without a doubt. Very complicated and, like you said, very dark, but it's absolutely fascinating. And it does, just to talk about it while you're actually sipping, the modern day product of where all that history has led to is just really
a wonderful experience.
So I know that we have one more to taste, which is Kilchoman.
The Kilchoman.
So when I went to Kilchoman, and I, like I said, I spent a week there. So I'm not claiming to be a Kilchoman, kind of expert, but I stayed. We stayed there. They had a tiny little still at this stage. They had not released. I think they were 3 years out. I think they'd done their first. But I think with the number one barrel, I've probably got a picture of me with the barrel somewhere. The first barrel. So we were at least 3 years out. And to me, I think it's become, as you pointed out, and I'd love to know why you think that happened. It's an expensive. I think expensive is the wrong word. It's a costly, expensive. It assumes that it's too much, and I don't know that that's the case because I'm not. Again, I'm not expert enough, but it's pretty expensive for what or pretty costly for what you get.
Yeah.
And I'm just interested what you think about it, because again, I look at it through these eyes of having been there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the price is what you would expect for it's a smaller production distillery. They are relatively young, so they have to obviously spend more money for producing a smaller amount of whiskey. Although they are expanding, they're becoming significantly bigger than they once were. And then just they do a lot of the stuff on site. They have the malting floor, they do a lot of that stuff, and that all gets baked into the price of the whiskey. And most enthusiasts will rave about Kilchoman in general, so the end product is you understand the kind of premium you're paying for Kilchoman, because
the end product does kind of stand out.
Having
years.
Physically done the floor malting and again, just the history of it, which I didn't know at the time, and I'm sure everyone watching this knows it because they, they're experts in it. But the whole notion of monkey shoulder and the pictures they had. So the people who were the distillers there, their parents had been, and fathers, brothers had been at other distilleries on the island, and there were pictures of some of them, and they really did have the monkey shoulder from the floor malting, from when they were turning, like 20 years of moving it, and the whole hump that they had there. And when you see that, again, you go, this was not a profession for the soft. This was, making whiskey was hard work. And the things that they allowed us to experience while we're there, like, trying to get us to sniff the wort and almost collapse. All the things that they do to the newbies, or even a sip of the wash, or all of those things that you kind of get to experience, changed how I think about whiskey.
Yeah, absolutely. But now when I was reading your chapter on your Kilchoman trip in Eat My Globe, your book, I like the part where after a day's worth of manual labor, you're like, wow, this is impressive that you guys have to do this every day. And the guy's like, oh yeah, well, we have this machine over here that does most of this work.
So they put you through the
Oh
ringer.
yeah, they deliberately did, but it's a great story. It's a beautiful place, and you know, again, like I said, I have a very soft spot for it. But I think this is, I mean, it's very enjoyable. I mean, there's nothing here that I wouldn't drink in a heartbeat.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is my first time trying this Kilchoman too. This is the only bottle of Kilchoman I have on my shelf because of the price is expensive for a non-aged stain for the most part. Though I need to change that because I know some cask strength Kilchomans are just from what I hear from people I trust are just to die for. But I mean, the nose is really nice on this one. You get that stronger peat. It's definitely a younger whiskey, and the palate it's pretty simple and straightforward, but it does everything right. It integrates the peat well with the young distillate, and it's a very pleasant whiskey.
So throwing it back at you, I come at this, like I said, from context. I come at it from history. I come at it, and if I start, like for me, if I go, well, I have to take one, I have to send everything back, and I have to keep one. To me, it would probably be the Kalila. I just go, I do, you know.
Yeah.
What if of all of these, and these are new openings for you, where would this put you in terms of you going, well, if I had to keep one?
If I'm just keeping one of the 5 we tried tonight, I would probably keep the Compass Box Magic Cask because I love peated whiskey. I love unpeated whiskey, but if I have a very well-aged, well-made, unpeated whiskey, that typically is something I prefer than a well-made, well-aged peated whiskey. Sometimes I feel like peat can kind of cover up some of the nuances that you'll find in an unpeated whiskey. So for me, I'm just curious to keep on exploring that Magic Cask. So that would be probably my pick for tonight. I liked some of the stuff I was getting from it, so it's one I would probably explore. But like you said, I am very intrigued and excited to explore all 5 of these. And the Cognac I've had before, but I'm very interested to
continue to build out my Cognac palate.
I mean, returning to that, the brandy brandy palettes to me are something. If you have it's someone once described it to me a bit like classical music, which is there's so much classical music out there, and you go, oh, and they go, oh, well, if you like Mozart, you're going to like Haydn. So if you like, so go and listen to that. So the way I think about this is, if you like the Cognac, to me, then you go into the Armagnac, then you go into Spain, then you go into Greece, then you go into, some of the most incredible brandies being made right now, inevitably, are in Japan.
Yeah.
I've got some phenomenal. I mean, almost inevitably, of course they are, because it's Japan, and they take something and they take it to the next level. But for me,
they do.
The good thing is that you can play around in this area of the Cognac without the expenditure that you might have to use in Scotch, where let's say things are people are pretty aware of how valuable things are. And I think it's go and have some fun with it. To me, once I'm kind of back in, kind of tasting again regularly, that's where brandy is always my kind of number one. And also realizing that some of the things that we think have been around, Hennessy, Courvoisier, they're really good. They're really, really good.
Yeah. Oh yeah, without a doubt. I mean, some of those, entry level spirits, be it whiskey, brandy, rum, anything, can definitely be a very nice gateway into those spirits. And it's a slippery slope. I mean, once you really dig your feet into something, you'll end up like me with this insane number of bottles of whiskey that it's going to take me years to get through. So it's definitely a slippery slope, and so I am always a little bit cautious going into a new spirit, because I know I could get a little carried away with it, but it does intrigue me. And like I also sent you a sample of that Fiji rum, 17-year-old rum. I mean, that one is a killer. That one's such a good rum that I hope you enjoy.
If you could see over here, which luckily you can't, there are bottles and bottles of every kind of spirit, every kind of from, all over. And so, because I take a very kind of wide view of spirits, because I just want to. So I just did an interview with Dave Wondrich for Eat My Globe about his new book, which is incredible, The Oxford Companion to Spirits and Cocktails. It's magnificent book, magnificent, with Noah Rothbone that he wrote. And we ended up having an entire conversation about Asian spirits, whether it's Baijiu, whether it's, and of course now I've got that in my head, and I'm like, well, I've never really, and it's like you said, it's like discovering, it's like, when I was a kid and my older brother I discovered his Frank Zappa records, and that was, which was great, but also bad, because I then became a Zappa completist and it cost me thousands of dollars. And that's kind of how I'm feeling about Baijiu and stuff like that right now. I'm like, well, I'm going to go and spend a fortune on this stuff. Thanks, Dave. And it is, but there are, in the bigger scope of things, there are worse things to be spending money on.
Yeah, no, without a doubt. And I listened to that episode that you had with him, and it was fascinating. And it does get you thinking, like, there's all these different spirits out there that I never even thought about trying. How is that going to build out my palate? It's something that you want to kind of pursue and kind of learn about and understand.
So I can.
The only thing I would suggest is, there's some very good whiskies being made in India. So I've got like the Paul John and the Amritsar, and I think some of them are. There's a Paul John Christmas edition that's it's almost like a Christmas cake. They sent me a bottle. It was really lovely. Yeah. But there's also. Yeah, and you have to be careful there. I talk about India just because of my family background. Back in the 70s, when they couldn't import anything into India, because of the laws, and they had this thing called IMFL, Indian-made foreign liquors. So they were all made in India, but they were all given names to sound as if they were from. So they had, Tower of London gin and Scott whiskey, and these things will drive you blind. So just be careful where you go tasting these things. Otherwise, they'll find you in Skid Row holding a bottle of this stuff.
Yeah, no, without a doubt. I'll definitely approach some of these new spirits very cautiously. And I mean, there's just in the whiskey world alone, is so much out there that I haven't really explored yet. That's why I'm always a little hesitant to move to something else, because it's like, well, I'm always going to come back to whiskey. I'm always going to want to try out the new Irish whiskeys or Indian whiskeys or Canadian whiskeys, Japanese whiskeys, and Taiwanese whiskey. I mean, there's a whole world of it out there that intrigues me that I haven't gotten to. And just in Scotland alone, there is so many different profiles and flavors that just try. It's a lifelong adventure. It's a journey. That's what we in the whiskey community call it. It's your whiskey journey. It's just something.
Well, I think what you're talking about, years ago, and it's still going. Penderyn with its Welsh whiskies, and it's almost hard to find somewhere that isn't making whiskey now.
Yeah, we're in the whiskey boom right now, and I mean, you'll know in the United States, the bourbon boom is out of control, where you can't get an allocated bourbon unless you're paying over $1,000. It's the craziness.
I keep away from that because I mean, I love bourbon. I mean, again, you have to be very strange not to, but I don't have the expertise to be able to justify spending that money. Put me in a brandy. I know where I'm spending the money, and I know why it is. But just don't put me into that situation with bourbon, because I can't justify it.
No, without a doubt. In bourbon, in my opinion, it's a lot more one-dimensional than in Scotch. The differences between several bourbons are going to be much smaller than differences between all the whiskeys we have, the Scotches we have tonight. So, for me, I have a few bourbons on my shelf. My go-to is the Elijah Craig Barrel Proof. I sent you a sample of that. So that, that's around, you can get that around $65-$70, and that's my high-end bourbon. I can't imagine my bourbon experience being much better than that. So I'm not too interested
to kind of go beyond that.
The potential varieties of Scotch, just by how they're made, and because of the laws are huge anyway. So there's plenty to play around with.
Yeah, no, without a doubt. And I mean, bourbons themselves are much more restrictive. You have to use a virgin oak cask. You have to use 51% corn. You can play around with the mash bill a little bit, but in general, they're all made in a very similar fashion. Whereas Scotch, if you have 100% malted barley in a pot still, you can have single malts from a variety of different casks, different yeasts, different fermentation times. Just the angle of the line arm and the pot still makes a difference in the outcome. It's incredible, all these different things that kind of go into it, and it just creates different whiskeys that you just end up loving. Absolutely. All right, so I know we're getting close to the end here. I do have a couple of just fun questions for you, similar to the end of your podcast. So aside from foods that your body can't tolerate, like oysters, is there a food out there that you just
don't like?
You can't shock everyone, but I hate pizza. I hate pizza.
You hate pizza?
I got into.
So what's the?
Yeah. I know I get a lot of trouble. I got into trouble for writing about it in an article once. I can't remember the film, and I called it snot on toast. And I got death threats.
Oh, that's not good.
I got
not
death
good at all.
Well, because people love their pizza, and I get it. It is very much of the it's not you, it's me.
Yeah. No, you may be the only person I've ever talked to who doesn't like pizza, at least some style of pizza, because there's so many. You got New York, you got Italy, you got Chicago deep dish pizza.
I like other flatbreads. Put me in Turkey and give me a lahmacun, or put me in Georgia and give me a cajapusta, whatever they call them, or give me all of that. There's something about it, and I don't know. I've never been able to explain it, and people can hate me for it, but I am who I am.
And I'm sure you've explored many
all the places that people tell me, whether it's here, there, everywhere around Europe, around the greatest places, I've tried them, and in the end I just go, it's not me.
What is the most unusual thing you've ever eaten? I know you've eaten a lot of unusual stuff.
I think probably the most unusual is from Iceland, which is called Caol, which is the sound you make when you eat it, throwing up afterwards. It's a basking shark that they found out. So during the winter, everything's kind of frozen there, and they have to eat what's on the island. But they have this basking shark that they kill, and if you eat it immediately, there's some acid in there that can actually kill you. And so they bury it.
Yeah.
And they tell tourists all kinds of stories about someone coming and peeing on it and all of that, which I don't believe. But they then hang it up, and so a small amount like this, like it's almost like a little piece of ham, would clear the room, and you drink it with a very, very powerful potato brandy. It's called Caol.
Okay.
It's grim.
Okay, that's so. I'm assuming you
definitely not one to be kind of buried and avoided.
When you're at a restaurant, it can be any style. What is your favorite
appetizer to order?
I am a sucker for really good fried calamari. Just every time.
All right.
And it's to do.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of the crunch. I'm a big fan of acid. So a little bit of lemon juice. I'm a big fan of seafood anyway. And it's fairly simple, but like going to a great steakhouse, really good steakhouse, and having a ludicrously big bowl of calamari. But the key, which is where my wife and I agree, is you've got to be a tentacle person. It's all about the tentacles.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I have to give you credit. I read, while reading your book and reading some of your chapters about like blood sausage and meat, was it pork pie or something like that? I'm a fairly tame. I'm not very adventurous when it comes to eating, but my wife and I went to Italy a few months ago. And reading your book encouraged me to kind of go outside my boundary. So I tried some foods out there that are you would consider are normal foods, but things that I hadn't eaten before. So I thank you for kind of pushing my boundaries.
Here's the thing that I say is it's like whiskey. You go, what's the worst that can happen? You have one bad bite. Give it a try. And if you discover something that changes your life, then thank you very much.
Yeah.
If you could share a dram of whiskey with 4 famous people, dead or alive.
Well, are we? So I have to ask a question. Am I allowed to go back, even take whiskey back beyond the point where it was even created? Oh,
Yeah. You can
okay,
choose
so I
anybody.
would love to sit with Plato and have a glass of something. I would love to love to sit, Plato, and like discuss philosophy and have a glass of whiskey, because I think he'd be so intrigued by the process of creating it that I think we would have just the most fantastic discussion. I would then go probably into, I would probably go into the kind of early Renaissance, early modern period, someone like Samuel Pepys, obviously one of the great kind of literary men of Britain, the man who buried, during the Great Fire of London, buried his Parmesan cheese in his garden, because that was the most valuable thing that he had. It was worth thousands. And that was the thing, that he was not worried about his wife's jewels. He wasn't worried about anything else. He buried a Parmesan cheese. So that's the kind of person that I would want to spend time with. I'd have a whiskey with him, and we would talk about London at its kind of, what's the word? Explosion into the city that it became. And London remains my favorite city.
Yeah.
One of them I'm lucky enough that I have done and do anyway, is Alton Brown. Alton's a very dear pal. He is without doubt the smartest person I've ever met in my lifetime. And so we have had many times where we've had either a martini. We filmed Good Eats, and I was on Good Eats with him, and we sat and we drank a martini, and we've drank whiskey, and we've shared whiskies together, and you are never disappointed spending time with Alton Brown. And the last one is I've spent it with my amazing wife here, and I would, which we do. Yeah. We travel around the world. We share, our Japanese whiskies. We share whatever. She is a super taster. She is actually physically a super taster. I could cook something where I'll put a tiny bit of something in there and immediately knows it. So when I'm having anything, I go, what is this? What am I tasting in this drink? What am I tasting? She'll immediately tell me. So those would be my 4 choices.
No, that sounds like an incredible table too. And, in my opinion, the best conversations are always had over a nice whiskey. There's nothing that can inspire a nice philosophical conversation than, chatting with a nice dram and good company. So that is a phenomenal list of
and my only kind of recommendation to people, we've had lots of discussions about incredible whiskies, and people will go and try them. I know they'll be inspired by what you're doing because of the way you describe them. But if you want to go and do something really odd, or not odd, just go and have a simple glass of Johnny Walker. Get a digestive biscuit. You can buy them at any British store, and have it with a nice slice of crumbly British cheddar on top. And then when you try it, email me and tell me that that's not one of the greatest food pairing experiences you've ever had. And you're not talking about anything that costs a gazillion dollars. If people are watching this, go and give it a try, because there's something very special about that.
Now, is there a specific Johnny Walker expression that you'd recommend, or
any Johnny Walker? You don't need to be going, up the candle, as it were. The sort of thing that I would go. Your granddad came home and goes, I need a scotch, and would grab the bottle from the cabinet that your grandmother had and pour about this much. Yeah. Throw an ice cube or a bit of water in there and just sit down and just. Again, so don't overthink it. Sometimes I think we think about food and we overthink them, or food and drink. Yeah. And sometimes you just go, oh yeah, let's just have some fun and give it a try. Yeah, and I guarantee you'll go, this is really nice.
No, I will definitely do that. I will document it, and I will let you know my thoughts on it. And I 100% agree. There's a time to analyze food and drink, and there's a time just to relax and enjoy it and not worry about it too much. So I will absolutely do that.
But I want to, again,
thank you for joining me here tonight. This was phenomenal. I hope we can do this again in the future.
I hope we can chat about the other samples I sent
you at some point. Yes, absolutely. And then, obviously once you can appreciate or experience them a little bit more than you can right now, that'll be wonderful too. But thanks again I know you're busy, you've got a lot going on, so I appreciate you taking the time.
I really appreciate you inviting me. I hope people watching didn't think I was completely ignorant. But I love it's food and drink. I mean, if you can't get excited about it, we should be in a different business.
No, absolutely. There's nothing more enjoyable than chatting with like minds and
just enjoying it
with other people.
Yeah, I hope you have a good night, and I'll be in touch with you.
I'm now going to drink a cup of tea and eat a big piece of cake.
That sounds delicious. That sounds like a great way to cap off your evening.
See you, everyone.
All right, take care.